Don't think I'll be working at Milestone Comics in the future. Better get the gold slow, y'all, cause we're having us a barbecue. Now available in paperback and e-readers, Isis Legacy. Sorority secrets of the goddess next door are revealed in this all-new Isis series adventure. Get Isis Legacy in paperback and e-readers at online booksellers everywhere. Last night, when I was on Facebook, I got a response from your Reginald Hudlin that ensures that I probably will never be working for Milestone Comics. Now, I was on the Facebook page for the Milestone Initiative, and your Reginald Hudlin dropped a comment on my post trying to tell me that I knew nothing about the icon character. Now, your Reginald Hudlin thinks that I did not read his comics in that absolutely dreadful 6-issue Icon and Rocket Season 1, but I wrote a response letting him know that I practically read almost every issue of Icon and Rocket Season 1, and I've done videos on almost all of the issues, and I practically stopped doing reviews on Icon and Rocket Season 1 because the series was absolutely terrible. However, I did finish all 6 of the issues, and I can tell you that the person who does not know the Icon character isn't Shawn James. No, the person who does not know the Icon character is your Reginald Hudlin. Now, your Reginald Hudlin is one of these guys who thinks he knows something about comics because he's a comic fan, but he doesn't know anything about the craft of storytelling. And one of the things a craftsperson like myself does before we put fingers to the keyboard is we go out here and we do our research first. And the first thing I do before I even again put fingers to the keyboard is my research, and I have read practically every issue of Icon from the first issue I bought off the street on Fordham Road in 1993 when Milestone launched, all the way up to the final issue in 1997. So I learned a lot about the background of the Icon character from practically reading the entire run. So I know quite a bit about the Augustus Freeman character, and I did not see any of the great traits of Augustus Freeman IV presented in your Reginald Hudlin's Icon and Rocket Season 1. No, I didn't see any of the depth, layers, and great character development that the late great Dwayne McDuffie presented in his initial Icon run in the pages of the absolutely dreadful Icon and Rocket Season 1. No, the character that Dwayne McDuffie and Mark Bright created, Augustus Freeman IV, the brother from another planet, is a very rich and multidimensional character who shows us what life was like for someone who grew up during the dark days of slavery, the days of Jim Crow, and went through the struggles of the civil rights movement. And as your Augustus Freeman was dealing with the struggles of having to navigate not only being an alien from another planet, he was also dealing with a world that was alienated from black people in having to navigate the white supremacy and racism that is a part of this country. And as your Augustus Freeman IV was out here trying to navigate through that racism and white supremacy, he was out here trying to make inroads for black people, but he was doing so with a stealthy approach. And that was something Dwayne McDuffie put into the character organically because he understood at the time a black man could not go out here if he had superpowers and go out here and put those powers on display, because it wasn't just about him being getting into trouble. It was also about reprisals from white racists coming after entire communities of black people. So the Augustus character went out here and was operating stealthily, helping out with the Underground Railroad, and he also helped out during the Civil War. He used a more covert approach to trying to overcome situations rather than using an overt approach, and that was something that was actually in line with history, and it was in line with the approaches that black leaders like your Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth used during the time of slavery and during the time of Jim Crow. So when Dwayne McDuffie created Icon, he had the character flowing organically to fit into history. But when you look at the pages of your Reginald Hudlin's Icon and Rocket, number I believe 2 or number 3, we get a splash page of Augustus Freeman going out here and murdering Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, during an uprising. And that doesn't fit and flow into history, and it doesn't flow organically. But this was something that your Reginald Hudlin believes would be something that people would want to see. But this is just bad writing because it shows that your Reginald Hudlin doesn't know the Icon character, and he doesn't know the history that was going on at the time. Now, the Icon character, the alien, had come from a collective of planets, and he was all about peace. And the whole thing was he didn't want to make things worse for people. So, as an alien who was looking to look out for his fellow brothers and sisters, he looked to use, again, the covert approach, because the covert approach would mean that there would be minimal lives lost. That's something that your Reginald Hudlin really didn't understand as he was doing his version of Icon, and his version of Icon went out here, participated in an uprising, and then went out here and murdered and decapitated Jefferson Davis, the head of the Confederacy, something that just comes across as completely absurd and does not flow organically into American history. Now, when you're writing fantasy that is got a historical base, you have to ensure that your story flows organically into the history of a time period. This is something that I took extensive care for when I did the first ISIS, and it was something that I took extensive care for when I did follow-up stories in the ISIS series, such as ISIS Imitation of Life and other stories related to it, such as the Thetas. Now, in the first ISIS, I had a story where ISIS was taking on some Ku Klux Klansmen who had lynched her husband and murdered her baby, but I didn't go out here and put historical figures into the violent murder where ISIS murders multiple Klansmen, because I knew that it would not flow organically into history. So I used generic people in that chapter of the first ISIS so that it would flow organically into history, and I would have a great story point to build on later on if I ever chose to explore the aftermath of ISIS's massacre, where she murdered these Ku Klux Klansmen for murdering her husband and her baby. And when I went out here and I did the story ISIS Imitation of Life, I had the ISIS character talking about how she was trying to help a young woman navigate through the dark days of Jim Crow in the late 1930s. And there I also took care to talk about the Jim Crow, but I also talked about the positive aspects, which were the black-owned businesses and other black-owned towns that had not been destroyed, such as Rosewood and Black Wall Street. I tried to take care to, while I'm making my historical fantasy, I also wanted to respect the events that transpired during the time. But Reginald Hudlin did not take that care, with Icon and Rocket as related to the murder of the President Jefferson Davis, and this is where his story started to fall completely apart. Because as he was building his structure for his new icon, he was not going out here and trying to stay true to the source material of the character. No, what he wanted to do was try to make the character fit into his own ideas instead of trying to go out here and see how the character worked mechanically and then craft stories that would fit the character. Now, as someone who has read the entire run of the late Dwayne McDuffie and Mark Bright's Icon, I can tell you that the Icon character would not act in the way that your Reginald Hudlin has presented him over the course of 6 issues. Now, your Augustus Freeman was a very conscientious individual, and he was a conscientious individual who looked out for not only himself, because he didn't want to get discovered, but he also looked out for his fellow brothers and sisters. And as he looked out for his brothers and sisters, again, this is why he used a covert approach to helping people during the 19th and early 20th century. And this is also why he was a black conservative. Now, a lot of people don't understand why Augustus Freeman was a black conservative, but as someone who has studied history, I can tell you why Augustus Freeman was a black conservative. Because during the days of slavery leading up to the Civil War, the Republican Party was supportive of black people. And there are numerous documents that show how the Republican Party was supportive of black people. So your Augustus Freeman would possibly be a Republican, and many of those black congressmen and the black senator who came out of the South during the Reconstruction, all of them were members of the Republican Party. And also, many of the prominent black professionals in the North were also members of the Republican Party. So Augustus Freeman, if he were to fit into history, he would be a conservative, because this was the party during the 19th century that supported the end of slavery. This was the party that supported abolition. This was the party that many blacks supported. So Augustus Freeman, being a black conservative, would be fitting organically into history. And as he was going on in history throughout time, he would possibly remain conservative, because as times were changing, he needed to remain conservative in order to protect his image and prevent people from finding out he was an alien. So I understood why Dwayne McDuffie did make Augustus Freeman a conservative, because the whole thing is a black person during the 19th century would be a black conservative, and they would also be conservative because they want to protect their image to prevent from being seen out in the open. Now, this flew over the head of your Reginald Hudlin, who didn't really care about the character, American history, or his background. So he went out here and just made Icon a one-dimensional character, not understanding the richness and complexity as related to the character. Now, I understand the richness and complexity of the character, because when I was creating the Isis character, who is over 2,000 years old, I understood that in order to fit that character into history organically, I needed to understand the politics going on in America, and I needed to understand the dynamics as related to the politics as related to the country in different time periods. Now, your Reginald Hudlin didn't really think about all of those nuances in his Icon and Rocket run, and his Icon and Rocket run is flat and one-dimensional compared to the rich complexity of the classic Dwayne McDuffie Mark Bright series. Now, in the Dwayne McDuffie Mark Bright series, we have Augustus Freeman, who is in his mansion by himself, and he's become a bit detached from people because he's lost his wife and he's just going through the motions of life, waiting for the day when he can go home. So he's basically existing until Raquel and her friends break into his home, and when they break into his home, that's when we start to see that Augustus protects his home, but also he's protecting his secret. But Raquel, who is dreaming of a better life, goes to your Augustus and proposes that they become Icon and the Rocket. Now, this is the core of the Icon character. It's his relationship with Rocket. That is the core of the character story. And the core of the character story is that your Augustus and Raquel are learning from each other. Your Augustus is learning about the modern world that he had become detached from, and your Raquel is learning from Augustus not only about being an alien, but also learning about the history of Black America from the past. It's a very, very unique relationship, and it's one of the core parts of the Icon book. But your Reginald Hudlin does not understand that relationship between Augustus and Raquel and what makes them work as related to their dynamics as a team. So your Augustus, he is somebody trying to reconnect with a world that he believes he is not a part of, and he reconnects by learning about that world and the culture from Raquel, and Raquel is learning about the past world of Black America and what made it so great, and she's learning from Augustus, who has experienced things like the Harlem Renaissance, experiencing things like the black businesses and a thriving black economy, and things like the black family being intact. He's experienced a completely different world as related to the black community, and he's there to teach her about that world that she never experienced, and because all she knows is the ghetto and the modern times, and he's there to teach her about how great black people can be. So there's a relationship dynamic between Raquel and Augustus, and your Reginald Hudlin in his 6 issues never touched on that relationship at all. No, in his 6 issues, he just basically goes out here and doesn't even touch the relationship between Augustus and Raquel. No, he throws away that incredible relationship between this alien and this human, and he replaces it with his one-dimensional characters and his one-dimensional ideas as related to story. So what your Reginald Hudlin replaces the rich and complex relationship between Augustus and Raquel with is his ideas about your Augustus having to deal with this Jedediah Lord, who is basically an evil white man who works for the government, who is out to go out here and kill Icon. So instead of us getting some rich depth, layers, and complexity as Raquel and Augustus learn how to be heroes, we get a flat, one-dimensional story rooted in conspiracy theories about an evil white man working for the government who's out to kill Icon and destroy him. And then on top of that, we really get some really one-dimensional ideas about your Rocket, who really doesn't get the character development she got in the original Icon book. And we don't get to meet her baby daddy Noble. We don't get to meet Darnice, who were key characters in the original series. No, they get replaced by some sort of love patrol and Xiomara, a black female lawyer who he's trying to make into the next big hero, but that character comes across as extremely flat and one-dimensional and really never actualizes her potential because your Reginald Hudlin doesn't know how to write three-dimensional characters, and he doesn't know how to create characters that make us care about them. No, he cannot go out here and craft a story because he's so busy trying to make a commercial concept for a movie that he doesn't understand that in comics you have to craft a story, and then you start thinking about something, you start thinking about your next story run. You don't sit there and think about making movies and TV, and you start thinking about what your next story is going to be, because it's your stories that are going to get adapted. And if you create bad stories, then there's no foundation for the source material. And there really wasn't much foundation for any material with your Reginald Hudlin's Icon. I mean, his run is filled with a lot of really serious structural errors as related to his story. His main character really is not developed well. His version of Augustus comes across as one-dimensional. His Raquel comes across as an afterthought in the series. She really doesn't have any of the depth and layers that Dwayne McDuffie's Raquel had, and we really don't get inside of her head and see her thoughts the way we did in the 1993 run. And we really don't get much character development as related to any of the characters because everything is just put together in a very sloppy way. Now, your Reginald Hudlin as a comic book writer is not very good, and over the course of 6 issues, we get books that just go from mediocre, which is the first issue, to absolutely terrible by the 3rd issue and the 4th issue. Now, by the 3rd and 4th issue, when your Icon is having a confrontation with your Jedediah Lord, that is where the pacing just falls completely apart, and the book becomes just completely uneven, and it just doesn't really start to flow very well. I remember reading the confrontation between your Jedediah Lord and Icon in his alien form, and as they're fighting, the pacing of the pages wasn't very good. I mean, we had a fight sequence between Icon, Rocket, and Ziomara and this alien and Jedediah Lord, and he cuts in the middle of the fight in one issue to intersect with a barbershop scene. Now, this page with the barbershop basically destroyed the flow of the action, and he takes a minute to have guys sitting in a barbershop talking about what's going on. When you're doing a comic book, you want to keep the action focused on what's going on as related to the bad guys, and that scene in the barbershop was one, if I were an editor, I would have cut that page because it took the reader out of the action, because what we wanted to see is how Icon overcomes the bad guys. We did not need an expository page to go out here and have some guys talking in a barbershop. And over the course of that issue, the pacing, it just becomes extremely uneven. We get cuts to scenes of life on the street and the bad guys, fighting each other, and it never really comes together in a cohesive fashion. Now, I myself have written fight sequences for books like from the first ISIS all the way up to the most recent ISIS book, number 19, Revenge of the Cyber Guards. That was the last book I did an action sequence for. And I did a action sequence recently for the new John Haynes Justified and John Haynes at Death's Door. And you never cut an action sequence, because if you cut an action sequence, you're taking the reader out of the action. And when you take the reader out of the action, they just don't stop caring. And it really, again, is frustrating for a reader when you cut them out of the action. And that's what your Reginald Hudlin did in that issue of Icon and Rocket. And it basically was the point where the book really started falling apart. Now, as he was going on in his 4th and 5th issues, we get the sequencing again not really coming together, and the sequencing in the 4th and 5th issues really, it was absolutely terrible. We get Icon talking about how he's got an undersea base like a fortress of solitude, and he's hiding out with Raquel's mother. And this sequence, it just makes no logical sense, because if Icon has the technology to make an undersea fortress of solitude, then why can't he go out here and design a ship to go home? So that really runs counter to what he originally put in his premise, which was Icon couldn't go home because he didn't have the technology, but he has the technology to make an undersea base, and he has the money to create an undersea base. Now, this really falls apart because, again, if you're, again, Augustus always did everything on stealth mode, and he always made sure that he protected himself because he did not want to be discovered. So this in and of itself sounds like Hudlin again trying to shoehorn ideas into Icon, like his Love Brigade and Ziomara, and also trying to shoehorn his ideas about Icon to try to make him more like Superman and not like himself. So this is Hudlin not really knowing the character, and I believe not caring about the character, and him trying to shoehorn his ideas onto the character, and shoehorning these ideas really have hurt the Icon character, because by the sixth issue it becomes a completely jumbled mess where your Jedi Lord is stalking Rocket and Static is coming in, and it really doesn't, the book falls completely apart because the hero of the book, Icon, is not the main center of the book, and the relationship between Raquel and Augustus is completely lost at this point, because your Reginald Hudlin is caught up in his feelings about these characters. He can't focus on the core aspects of the story. And this is something that many emotional writers do because they get caught up in their feelings about a character. They don't really think about the craft as related to their stories. Now, I myself am a fan of Milestone comics and a fan of the Milestone characters. However, as a craftsperson with over 30 years of writing experience in the novel, in screenplay, and comic books, I know that I have to be professional when I'm writing a story. And if a book is titled Icon and Rocket, then I need to make sure that Icon and Rocket are the focus of the story, and that, those characters don't get overwhelmed by a whole host of background characters, because if you're not really focused on the lead characters, then I have failed, because you're not really focusing on the most important part of the story. It's like a chef who works at a steakhouse. His focus needs to be on making sure that the steak is the hero of the plate, because if you're focused on the potatoes or the side dishes, he hasn't done his job, because your job at that steakhouse is to make sure that those steaks are the centerpiece of that whole plate. And that's where the mistake is with your Reginald Hudlin. He has really talked about how much he knows Icon, but when I take a critical examination of his Icon is not the icon that is the front and center of the book, and his story has become completely lost due to his really awkward, jumbled, and really uneven writing, and his inability to really craft and develop compelling characters and craft a compelling story. Now, the whole concept of a brother from another planet is very interesting, and his observations of America and its racism would be the stuff that would make for some truly great fantasy and science fiction stories. Unfortunately, your Reginald Hudlin seems to be out of his depth as related to writing these kinds of stories. Now, I myself had to write something similar when I first started writing the Isis character. I was writing about a Nubian goddess who came to America. And as I was writing this character, Isis, I was thinking about coming to America and confronting white supremacy, living in this culture of white supremacy, and thinking about the impact that it would have on somebody's mind. And when I was creating the Isis character, I said, one of the things that inspired me was the Icon comic. And as I saw it, I said, men and women are different. Your Icon would be a logical person, whereas your Isis would be an emotional person. And this is one of the things that would lead to your Isis having her breakdown and killing those Klansmen, was the fact that dealing with decades of white supremacy and racism, having that affect her mind, and then seeing her family murdered in front of her. This is what would lead to her murdering these Klansmen, and this would lead to her winding up in a situation where she wouldn't be taken out and tried by the gods. So I understood that there was a deep psychological component to being an outsider and experiencing racism and white supremacy. And while your Augustus coped with it by trying to, again, deal with things in a covert fashion, and Isis also dealt with it in a covert fashion, it takes a toll on the human mind. And while your Augustus is alien, he still had to deal with those stresses. And while people would say he could have done something like that whole Jefferson Davis scenario, no, he wouldn't have done that, because he understood that during that time, those consequences would come back to haunt other black people. And that's something that, again, when I look at Reginald Hudlin's Icon, he's not really understanding history, he's not really understanding the time period, and he's not really understanding the character, and he doesn't really get the character. Now, he wants to tell me I don't get the Icon character, but I believe that I get the Icon character. I understand that he's a very rich and complex character, and I understand that he has dealt with racism, and he's dealt with white supremacy, and he understands the subtle politics transpiring around him. And while he's trying to be a hero, he's not trying to go out here and his main focus isn't saving the world. His main focus is mentoring and teaching Raquel so that she can understand about that the way to save the world isn't just doing superhuman things, it's doing human things that allow you to help everybody one-on-one. Now, the whole Reginald Hudlin Icon had a lot of absurd things like taking out all the drug dealers, and then we had other aspects of it that really just came across, again, as forced and awkward, and it really didn't come together to make a really solid, organic story that gave us a compelling presentation of the character and show us what made the character great back in 1993. Everything that Hudlin did with Icon basically set the character back 30 years and basically gave us a Icon that really doesn't represent what I believe the late great Dwayne McDuffie meant to represent, because what he was trying to represent was a positive example of a hero who was not just being a hero as related to saving the world, but he was also trying to be a hero by mentoring a young woman and helping her learn how to be a role model for others. So there's a lot of things that were going on with the Icon character, and your Reginald Hudlin doesn't get all of the little subtle nuances as related to that character, and he doesn't really get all of the layers and complexity as related to that character. And that's one of the reasons why I couldn't work at his version of Milestone, because his version of Milestone really doesn't give us what's really great about these characters. No, what we get is a lot of identity politics, social justice, and a lot of flash, but we don't get any of the substance that makes these characters truly great. No, all of that is completely lost because Reginald Hudlin has stars in his eyes. He's thinking about movies, TV, and merchandising, and any good creator understands you can't think about those things because those things are not something you're going to achieve at all if you don't have good stories. The main thing that when I'm out here focusing on at SJS Direct with characters like Isis, John Haynes, Easting, or Matilda Crowley, or Lilith Graves, is I'm focused on trying to give people the best stories possible, because when you give people the very best stories possible, then you can go out here and then people will see how great the stories are, and then you get the offers for merchandising and licensing, and you can adapt that material and make sure that it stays true to the source material. Unfortunately, Reginald Hudlin again has those stars in his eyes, and he wants to tell me, again, I don't know about the character, but the whole thing is, he doesn't know about these great Milestone characters, and I told him so in a Facebook reply, and I let him know that I know more about those characters, and I know about many of the technical mistakes he made during his run. So he thought he was going to come back and try to embarrass me, but I checked him, and again, that's because I care about these characters. These characters meant a lot to me in college because these were the first black superheroes I saw in their own universe. And if I had the money to run Milestone, I would be working to preserve those characters' integrity, and I definitely would be working to create a much better series of Milestone books than sadly what your Reginald Hudlin has produced, because Dwayne McDuffie did a fantastic job on these characters, and that fantastic job is being marred and tarnished by your Reginald Hudlin's Milestone 2.0, and his Milestone 2.0 is just a hot mess. A mess that I look at because he doesn't know the characters, and ironically, he wants to tell me I don't know the characters, even though I have sat down and read the entire run of Icon multiple times, got to know these characters, got to know their backstory, and understand that when you're crafting a character like Icon and Rocket, the core thing is the relationship, and that's one of the big things that's missing from your Reginald Hudlin's Icon, because it's so flat and one-dimensional. We don't see any relationships between the characters. We don't really see why they are either friends or enemies. We really don't see anything that really connects us to the characters, and we really don't see anything that makes us care about these characters, because your Reginald Hudlin is like a fan looking on the outside at these characters and thinking that they're cool, and not thinking about the craft of the stories or the care that's needed to make these characters work inside of a compelling story. It's him who does not have the craft or the ability to write good Icon stories, and this is the problem with him. And again, I looked at his run as related to those 6 issues, and after reading those 6 issues, I had practically stopped making videos about them in 4, and if I were at a comic shop, I would have probably dropped this book by the entire 6th issue, and you wouldn't see me for the season 2, because the season 1 was a complete disaster. And this is something he doesn't really understand. He's talking about trying to have an initiative to bring in new creators, when the whole thing is his craft isn't on point. And with his craft not being on point, he shouldn't be trying to recruit new talent, because what he's going to do is teach that new talent to make mistakes. And that's the other big problem with your Reginald Hudlin, is he doesn't really understand that his craft is not on point, and all he's trying to do is bring in new talent to come in. But the whole thing is, if you can't lead your talent and you can't learn from your mistakes, you're going to go out here and make some books that are absolutely terrible. And when I look at your Reginald Hudlin's Milestone, it's not in a place where it can compete with companies like Concrete Comics, who are making great books like Acolyte, Absolver, and Odina. There's just, the competition out here is really fierce, and your Reginald Hudlin's Milestone is in no place to compete, and he's having a Milestone initiative to try to recruit new talent. And I walked away from that because I said, The way he's teaching people is not going to teach them to make great comics, and it's also going to lead to people losing their IPs to corporations. Yes, you'll get the exposure, but the whole thing is you won't get any wealth. That's one of the posts I put on. I said you'd just be better off putting your books on Kickstarter and putting your own comics out there and keeping all of your IPs. But what's worse is you're not going to learn any skills that are going to help you develop your craft as a writer. Because if a bad writer is teaching you bad skills and not teaching you to do things like research, you're going to go out here and create bad comics, just like Reginald Hudlin does. Now, my upcoming comic, John Haynes at Death's Door, is coming to Kickstarter, and if you want to pick up that comic, you'll be able to pick it up soon. But until then, you can pick up my first comic, Easting No Good Deed, on Amazon.com's Kindle for 99 cents, and you can pick up the books of the ISIS series, the Easting series, and the John Haynes series on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. And if you want to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and e-readers, ISIS, Revenge of the Cyber Goddess. The goddess next door takes on the threat of a deadly digital diva driven to destroy the world in this action-packed, all-new ISIS series adventure. Get ISIS, Revenge of the Cyber Goddess, featuring a bonus pin-up and the other 2 books in the Cyber Goddess saga at online bookstores everywhere today.